The world was saddened to hear about the deadly terrorist bombings that took place this last Easter at a number of Catholic churches and hotels in Sri Lanka. What's behind the bombings? What does it mean for Christians living there? Gary Stagg is the Executive Director of OpenDoors Canada, and he joins me now via Skype from Mississauga. Gary, the unusual part in this recent terrorism is that the tensions in Sri Lanka are normally ethnic. The problems usually arise between the government and the separatist group, the Tamil Tigers. Is it true that for many years, relations between Sri Lankan Christians and Muslims have been reasonably friendly?
Yes, and this is where the whole shock of Easter Sunday came to all of us. We were not anticipating this. I mean, we are holding our breath every Easter, uh, wondering not if there's going to be a church bombing, but where the church bombing will be. That's just the reality of the day that we live in, because we've seen so many church bombings over the past number of years, and it just seems to be escalating. And of course, churches are usually targeted on their most holy days, and so Easter Sunday, being the most holy day of the year, we were expecting, a church bombing or church bombings, but it came out of left field for us. The fact that it was in Sri Lanka.
Gary, I was reading a report that said moderate Muslim leaders have actually warned the government 2 years ago about the leaders of those recent bombings. So should we believe that there's hope for peace?
I think that normally the situation between Muslims and Christians in Sri Lanka has always been a fairly peaceful one. Um, the problem, of course, it came where there was again an extremist group, which was we believe something that was a part of ISIS that had kind of gone back to the country and caused that situation. But the problem was that, and you mentioned that there were warnings, and there were indeed warnings about this situation. Unfortunately, there is a lot of upheaval within the country itself, within the government, and so on. And so those warnings weren't heeded, unfortunately, and so it got us to Easter Sunday.
Now, Sri Lanka, as many know, has a majority Buddhist population, but many are surprised by the association of violence with Buddhism. But it does exist in Sri Lanka. How long has Buddhist extremism been directed at Christians?
We see Buddhist extremism not only in Sri Lanka, but we see it in other countries as well. Um, we do typically think of, but when we think of Buddhism, we think of Zen, we think of peace and harmony and all of those kinds of things. But again, extremism is the situation, and we have things like when there's religious nationalism that takes hold in a country, which we're seeing increasingly all over the world. For Buddhist countries like Sri Lanka, for instance, in India, we have the situation with Hindus, and same thing, religious nationalism. And then that fires up the extremists who think it's their right then that they can basically pick on the minority religions in the country.
Are Christians allowed to build churches and gather together freely to worship in Sri Lanka?
In Sri Lanka, they have the constitutional right to freedom of religion. There was a situation about a year ago where one group was denied something because of proselytizing. And so, but generally speaking, they do have a constitutional right for freedom of religion. But again, it's one thing to have freedom of religion, but the situation is the freedom to change one's religion. And so that's often in dispute. You have a freedom to believe what you want to believe and to worship how you want to worship, but you don't have the freedom to change that religion. And of course, many religions are proselytizing religions, and that's where the situation comes in, because they feel threatened that the church is growing and the church is proselytizing more of their people, and that tends to get a backlash.
So how does the mainstream media there portray Christianity? Do they view a lot of Christians as extremists?
No, they don't. They don't look on them too favorably because, again, Christianity is a very small part of the population of Sri Lanka. It's, I believe, 7% of the country is Christian, and out of that, only um, I believe 1.2% of that is evangelical Christians, or there's 300,000 evangelical Christians. And so they don't look too favorably on them because of what I just spoke about. They see them as proselytizing and impinging on the Buddhist religion.
Now, I understand that some young extremist leaders are also making use of social media to target Christians by spreading false stories about them, which can then lead to violence.
Yes, it's well. This is the world that we live in, right? You know, we all live with the joys and the angst of social media, and unfortunately, it's used again to spread falsehoods. And in Sri Lanka, it's been used to spread falsehoods about Christians, and in particular, evangelical Christians. But also, it's been used to target. Stories of false stories of Muslims, and so yeah, it's a real threat for sure. And of course, it just gains the lies are told, and then it just gains more fuel, and that's where we get the sometimes the acts of violence against Christians. I spoke to you a while back about the World Watch List, Open Doors World Watch List. Sri Lanka is number 46. It's pretty low on the list, but yet we do know of a number of more than 60 cases last year of violence against Christians or attacks against Christians. And so a lot of those things are spurred on by lies and things that are put out on social media, which gives people the feeling that they have the right to retaliate.
How about financial persecution, Gary? Do Christians have trouble getting hired, or do some companies refuse to sell to Christians?
We know of a number of situations where Christians have been denied jobs. In Sri Lanka, there's been a number of teachers who have been denied positions to teach because of being Christians, and that's a general problem all over the world when it comes to Christian persecution. Christians are often try to keep Christians to the lowest rung of society, and so they will be denied jobs. They'll be denied finances, and their children will be denied education in the better schools. They will be kept in just really to try to keep them down. And so that is a real problem for them for sure. And so that affects them financially all around.
Gary, why don't you share with our viewers for just a moment here what happens in Sri Lanka when a Buddhist converts to either Christianity or Islam? How does that person's family and community respond?
Well, because of Buddhism being the major religion in the country, um, normally when a person converts to Christianity or Islam, they will be ostracized by their family, and not only by their family, but also they'll be ostracized by their whole community. And so they live in isolation, basically. It's often that way everywhere, isn't it? If somebody decides to leave a strict religious organization to go to another one, that organization will shun them or isolate them.
Let's also talk about the nearby nation, Myanmar. They too have a minority population of Muslims who've suffered terrible persecution from that government. When a Rohingya Muslim converts to Christianity, how are they treated?
Likewise, we say that Christians in Myanmar are the doubly persecuted because just by the fact of their nationality, their ethnicity, they're persecuted because generally they are Muslim. Rohingya are Muslim people, and so you've got that persecution in that country because the country is persecuting them. But then if you have believers that convert to Christianity from Islam within the Rohingya population, they suffer persecution from their own people. So it's like a double whammy. They're what we call the doubly persecuted. So they're persecuted by their nation, first of all, because that's their ethnicity, but also because of the fact that their own Islamic family will persecute them as well for making that decision.
Gary, what is Open Doors doing to bring peace to these areas and to support believers?
Well, in Sri Lanka in particular, I'll speak to that because we're talking about that today. We were there immediately after the bombings, standing with the Christians that went through that horrific bombings, I should say. And I know that a number of our staff were there to attend the funerals of those who had lost their lives. And just standing with them, we're a ministry of presence. And I've always kept that as a center focus, as a focus of our ministry, where we go and we stand with persecuted believers all around the world. We were there for that. We continue to offer them counseling, trauma counseling. We're also offering right now. There's an emphasis on persecution preparedness because unfortunately we can't think of this as an isolated event, but because of this event, it can spur on more trouble in the country, and so we're trying to really educate the people there. We're trying to disciple them so that they understand how to respond to persecution when it happens. We're helping 250 families that have been affected by the loss in the country. I think of one story of a little guy by the name of Jackson. He's a 13-year-old boy who was, the children were, when the bombing happened, the children were actually walking back to the main service for the breakfast time when the bomb was detonated. And little Jackson was walking with his aunt, who was also his Sunday school teacher, and they were both killed in the bombing. Also, Jackson's uncle, so the husband of the Sunday school teacher, also lost his life about a week later because of the injuries that were inflicted on him. And so now we talked to Jackson's father, and he's lost his sister, his brother-in-law, his son, so many other friends and church members that he's lost. But we've come alongside of people like that just to strengthen them and to help them know that they're not alone in this, that there are Christians all over the world who are praying for them, who are standing behind them, who are doing all that we can to help them through this situation. And it's wonderful to hear the testimony of this man who knows that he lost his son. He said, I had my son for 13 years, but now God has him for eternity. And so a great perspective, a great mature perspective on that. And we want to see more of that maturity in the body of Christ in Sri Lanka. And so we're trying to bolster their faith in whatever way we can.
Gary, that's a powerful story, definitely. What else outside of prayer can our viewers do to really help Open Doors bring assistance to Christians in Sri Lanka?
I always say, it's so easy for us in the West, in a place like Canada, where we can hardly imagine this kind of thing happening. But it doesn't mean that we can turn a blind eye to what's happening all around the world. And the truth is, it's not getting any better. It's getting worse. Persecution is on the rise. It's been steadily on the rise for the past number of years. This past year saw a huge spike in persecution around the world. So we need to educate ourselves. We need to understand what's happening. Prayer, of course, is the number one thing that they ask us for. But I always say we need to be aware, and we need to pray with the understanding that we know who these brothers and sisters are. And so, we provide a prayer calendar a monthly prayer calendar for anybody that wants it. They can go on to our website, opendoorsca.org, and they can download a copy of that. They can sign up to have a copy delivered to their home. They can tuck it in their Bible, and every day there is there's a prayer request with an actual name attached to it. Sometimes the name is changed for security reasons, but you know that when you're reading that, you're reading an actual story of somebody from the persecuted church, and you can read that story and then just pray a brief prayer. That's how I got involved with the persecuted church 20 some years ago, is that I started with the prayer calendar. And so I would encourage people to download that prayer calendar. Get a copy in the mail if you prefer that. And also our newsletter, our magazine that goes out every other month, has stories about all of these things that are happening around the world. And I think it's really important to be engaged with this and to advocate on their part whenever we can.
Gary Stagg is the Executive Director of Open Doors Canada. Thanks a lot for joining me today from Mississauga.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great night.